Thank you for tuning into the 𝗂𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 podcast. We bring together young scholars, professionals, and experts to talk about the evolving relationship between the European Union and China. To dive deeper into this theme, be sure to catch our new episodes every 2 weeks. And welcome to the 𝗂𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 community. Today, we are joined by Ambassador Massimo Ambrosetti, Italy's ambassador to the People's Republic of China, a diplomat, scholar, and one of Italy's foremost experts on China. Ambassador Massimo Ambrosetti entered the Italian diplomatic service in 1991 and has dedicated much of his career to China and international strategic affairs. He has served as Italy's permanent representation to NATO in Brussels, at the Italian embassy in Washington, and as deputy permanent representative to the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Ambrosetti, welcome to 𝗂𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀.
My great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start with a little bit of introduction. You first arrived in Beijing in 1994 as a diplomat. So I was curious to ask, what changes have you noticed in China since then? And what surprises you the most about the country today compared to when you first encountered it?
Well, of course, my answer is the obvious one. The changes have been dramatic, structural, really. The country, the society, also the physical dimension, I would say, of China has changed. And so, I witnessed this process driven by not only economic growth, but also, I think, a societal change, also by socioeconomic and cultural factors. And more recently, and this is really what surprised me in a particular way when I came back, is the digitalization of the system, of the society, of the daily life of the Chinese people. This is really, I think, the digital sphere, the fact that innovative technologies are part and parcel of the daily life of every Chinese citizen is really the most striking feature. At the same time, I would add that against this massive, this profound and structural change, I feel that there are things related to the cultural and civilizational dimension which have changed, but not so much. So I think that is always good to bear in mind that, of course, China is a country, a nation state, but also a very ancient civilization. So the mindset of the Chinese is deeply rooted in things which are not entirely related to this more recent dramatic process of change.
You have dedicated decades of academic research to China's rise as a global power. So I was curious to ask, what drew you to this topic, and why do you think it's so fundamental today to engage with China and understand its system?
Well, first of all, you're very kind to describe myself as an expert. I would say that I've been a China watcher for quite a long time, and also an observer of this process of change from the standpoint of international relations. I think that this is very important. I think that the way the Chinese system works, the way the society is shaped, is related to a set of factors which are not necessarily only those connected to what in international relation theory are the material dimension of a state's international behavior, and this is true also, I would say, at the subsystemic level, because I think that to understand China, and this is my answer, we need to be sophisticated in choosing our epistemological approach, meaning that our strategies of knowledge and of understanding China need to refer to something which is not related to hard power, the economic dimension, even the technological dimension, but to understand that there are ideational elements which are very relevant. And I think that this was exactly the reason why we didn't read the more recent change in China in the right way. So we thought that the so-called paradigm of constructive engagement could be really the transformative process to socialize China into the world liberal order. And this didn't happen very clearly. But because we underestimated the political dimension, the fact that the Chinese Party state refers to an ideological dimension and also to an historical dimension, because I think that and this refers to what I've just said, answering the previous question. Historical identity is related to the People's Republic of China, but is also related, and this is, by the way, a reference that we read fairly regularly in official document, to the so-called traditional values. So the traditional values are these very, very important, very diversified, but very deeply rooted cultural and civilizational dimensions.
Then what are your main priorities and goals for your mandate as Italian ambassador to China?
Well, we had very specific issues which were related also to the approach when I arrived of our new government to our bilateral relationship, which, by the way, is driven by a comprehensive strategic partnership, which offers us all the tools. It's a very good toolbox for cooperating. But this is not enough because, of course, I think that the problem is not the bilateral relationship between Italy and China, even though we have very concrete and very challenging problems, for instance, in the economic dimension, which, by the way, reflect some of the most pressing problems that the European Union has with China. But I think that what is really challenging is that our bilateral relationship is inscribed in a broader context, an international context, which is very complex, with a high degree of polarization. So this is part of our daily work to connect, and this is, of course, ambassadors are not the policy makers. We are, the people who have to present, have to negotiate, have to, of course, cooperate on the basis of guidelines that our political masters decide. But said this, I think that we are all very context sensitive. I think both on our front as Europeans and on the Chinese front, and the context is very complicated.
I also wanted to briefly touch upon your academic background. You hold a PhD from Cambridge University and also a doctorate from Georgetown. Both focus on China's role in the international system. Is there one insight from your research that has proven most useful in your day-to-day work as ambassador?
Well, I think that this is what I refer to when I talk about the need of being sophisticated in terms of epistemology. I think China for me was a cultural shock. I didn't have a specific background. When I studied in Italy, I didn't focus specifically on China. Then I joined the diplomatic service and was assigned just by chance to the Asia-Pacific desk, and so I started dealing with Chinese affairs, and I was fascinated by this rising great power, but by also all the background that I mentioned. And when I arrived here, it was of course a cultural shock, because in a positive way, the country was very different, was developing very rapidly, but you could still see things of old China even though, of course, it was not the old China of the imperial period. But what I think was very important is that to understand China and also to get practical, concrete results, you need to have in mind the broader picture. And the broader picture, in my case, was that hard power, as I already argued, the economy are important, but in China, the political interaction is driven by these cultural, intellectual factors. And so this is also a way to deconstruct a little bit a deterministic view. For instance, I gradually become convinced that the big paradigm based on the so-called theories of hegemonic transitions was not necessarily the right or the only standpoint to understand the change taking place in China, because there were, for instance, fundamental actors such as the Chinese party state, which were driven by a different approach. So I think that this is the reason why I think that nowadays, in particular, in the age of artificial intelligence, we are absolutely bound to have a lifelong process of learning, of understanding. For China, this is very true.
A bit of a more personal question then, regarding your academic background. If you could, is there any advice that you would give your younger self who was first approaching China in an academic setting?
Well, I think what to really miss, and in this respect, like a quotation by this great French, Romanian intellectual, 𝗔𝗺𝗯𝘀𝗀𝗁𝗍, who wrote that we don't live in a place, we live in a language. So I think that the linguistic dimension is key in China, and I'm not a linguist in this respect, so I've studied the Chinese, but I never had a real command of it, and so this is a little bit the missing piece. But what I think is also for the younger generation is also to be multidisciplinary. Now we have a debate related to artificial intelligence, how to respond as humans to the challenge of the potential replacement by machines. And I think that what is unique and what is really also the added value, and is also intrinsic, for instance, in our background as diplomats, is being multidisciplinary, to connect the dots in a way which is not necessarily the most obvious, but which probably can be also conducive to better results. So with China, it's very often not a case of a linear process in approaching the issues that we want to address and hopefully to solve, but to perhaps to have a more strategic, not linear approach. And this, I think, is supported in a more effective way if you are able to reason in a multidisciplinary way.
So I also wanted to ask briefly about EU-China relations more specifically. How do you see the current security and strategic background? How do you think it shapes how you read the EU-China relationship today? As
I've already said, this is absolutely key. I think that, and also this is the challenge. I think that what should be, and this is part also of Italy's approach, is that we can and we need to find a common ground, because of course the international system cannot work without the contribution and also without a consensus on existential things by the major actors. So I think that it would be realistic to think that there is a balance of power without China as a contributor, as the famous definition, a responsible stakeholder. But we have to engage China in a different way, because of course it's true that there are very strong elements also of strategic competition, which are not necessarily, a part, in my view, of a dynamic of what is called, hegemonic transition. And I think that when our Chinese counterparts argue that China has never sought an hegemony in its millennia-old history, there is more than a grain of truth. It's true. We can argue that it was anyway the cultural hegemon in East Asia, etc., etc. But I think that this is very important. A consensus is based on dialogue, and I think that in this respect, Italy is very well equipped, because we have a long history of interaction related, of course, to great figures such as, it seems that this is a little bit of diplomatic rhetoric, but it's not, such as Marco Polo. And when we celebrated the 700th anniversary, I was almost surprised by seeing that our Chinese counterparts were even more interested in us in underlying the importance of this iconic figure, because it was a period of sort of proto-globalization. It was a peaceful dialogue. It was also the recognition by a Western man that the Mongol, the Chinese Empire, was a more advanced system in socio-economic terms. But of course, we have also the great figure of Matteo Ricci, the founder, we could say, of intercultural dialogue. So this I think, in our case, is also a reason to try to be a contributor, first and foremost within the European Union, because of course as a founding member we want to contribute to reshape an effective, balanced EU-China policy which goes in this direction. But I think realistically, it will not be easy. We are still, we are not close to finding this new consensus, but I'm convinced that this is possible, and a middle ground is always a point where the two sides have to converge. So, the success depends also on the attitude of the Chinese government.
The EU also describes China simultaneously as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. From your point of view here in Beijing, which of those three feels the most dominant right now?
Right now, there is a strong focus on this idea of the systemic rivalry. But I think that we should be a little bit more granular, in the sense that I think that this was an excellent. I remember when the strategic outlook was published in 2019. And so my point is that this at the time was a very good description of a transitional phase. We had the perception in 2019 that the old paradigm of constructive engagement, comprehensive engagement was behind us. So we were looking for a new formula which could encapsulate the new reality. So this was good, but it was a description for a transitional period. Now the challenge is to make it a working, far-sighted, I would say, effective China policy. So when we talk about aspects of strategic rivalry, we have to be very concrete in saying what is right now, the most pressing issue that we should solve. And of course, I would respond to this question by saying, of course, technological development and diffusion. But this does not depend only on China. China is terribly competitive in a strategic way vis-à-vis Europe. Of course, the case of new energy vehicles is a very good case in point. But this is not aimed at Europe as a part, in my view, of a strategic design of competition. This was driven also by an incredible ability of the Chinese system to be innovative, to be, of course, rapidly developing in the most advanced sectors. And of course, this intrinsically is a huge challenge for Europe in terms of our industrial policies and development policies and technological policies. But we have to recognize that we were late, and this is true not only vis-à-vis China, but it's true also vis-à-vis the United States. We were late in recognizing that we were, not developing at the same pace of the US and China. So it's a problem of competition with China, but it's also a problem of growth, development, and technological innovation in Europe. And I think this is recognized, and this will be the framework for our interaction in the coming months, in the coming years with China. Secondly, I would say that we should not forget that there is still a very significant cooperation between Europe and China. It's very unbalanced in commercial terms, so we need to this rebalancing, and our Chinese counterparts should be aware that this is not only an economic problem, but is a political and strategic problem. But in doing this, we should take advantage of all the different dimensions of our comprehensive strategic partnership between the European Union and China, because I think that to get concrete results, we need also to be perceived as Europe as a truly strategic actor, and this has been the case for a long period. Now we are in a transitional, of course, phase. We need perhaps a fine-tuning, but I'm absolutely confident that this is achievable, but it needs a very big effort in terms of strategic foresight from our part, but also from the Chinese side. So I think that we need a lot of political interaction, and not only focusing on the many pending issues which exist, and that I don't want to underestimate in terms of market access, in terms of protection of intellectual property, in terms of a lot of things which are basically the cahier of doléances right now of the EU-China strategic relationship. But we are not building on weak foundations. The partnership, what we did and we are still doing at present is very significant. So we have solid foundations. Just to make an example, for Italy, China is the most important after the US extra-European market for our export, but is also a country where we have more than 1,500 companies established, and of course producing a lot of things, and the business turnover of these companies, just to give you an example, is more than 33 billion euros per year. So we are talking about big numbers, because this is always the case with China. The numbers are very big. The market is very big. It's a very demanding, a very challenging market, which is changing. So success for sure is not granted, but anyway, is not a market that we can dismiss without considering all the very concrete implications for us. There is, of course, the big issue of de-risking. I think that Italy is a good example we did the risking that we deemed appropriate, but the risking doesn't mean that we don't have areas of cooperation which are mutually beneficial.
The US-China rivalry is also reshaping global trade, technology, and security. Where do you place Europe in this dynamic, and how does Europe navigate these tensions?
Well, I think that first of all, and I think that this should be part, even though, of course, I repeat it, we need to be realistic because there are a lot of tensions, and it's a good way to try to address complex things, not to underestimate the degree of complexity. But I think that we should reduce, the logic of economic security whenever it's possible. I think the EU has been doing something which was to some extent long overdue when we talk about a lot of things. Also, the more recent legislative interventions, which are reasonable. This, of course, was met by negative reactions by our Chinese counterparts, but it's exactly what China has been doing for decades. China has been focusing on economic security in a logic, of course, of national strengthening and also strategic competition. So we should put this sort of dynamics in the right perspective. Europe is not doing something which is strange, because China has done exactly the same thing before us. But this doesn't prevent political dialogue, political interaction, strategic interaction, which can be conducive to those areas of cooperation which still exist. Because at the end of the day, the European single market is the best possible market for Chinese export. We should, for instance, just to give you an example, bear in mind that every BYD car which is sold in the European single market generates a profit which is 10 times bigger than the profit that the same sale generates in China. So in this respect, we have leverage, and I think that we can find a common ground for, of course, having a path forward, a future of course, industrial growth and technological growth, both in China and Europe, which is not necessarily only, conflicting with very, very important, very existential interests.
Talking briefly about Italy-China relations now more specifically, in your opinion, what makes the Italy-China relationship distinctive culturally, historically, economically, within the broader European context?
Well, first of all, because it's a very old relationship, as I've already argued. It dates back to, of course, the period of the Roman Empire, when Romans were buyers of Chinese things such as silk. So, a lot of Roman precious metals arrived in China in payment of, for instance, of silk. Even though, of course, the two empires never had a direct contact because of the Persian Empire in between, which prevented this direct relationship. But said this, of course, from the Middle Ages, we had these travelers, we have also missionaries, because especially at the time of the Mongol Empire, there was a little bit the idea that China could become a Christian, and of course this in Rome was a very important perspective for the Pope. But then we had another season of contacts and of learning, because of course Matteo Ricci, the Jesuits, and the other Europeans were protagonists of an incredible travel of knowledge, as we called our exhibition Marco Polo. So and Italians were, of course, part of this process. There is a Chinese scholar who said that in the three last Chinese dynasties, the go-between between China and Europe probably can be identified in Italian figures, because during the Yuan dynasty was Marco Polo, the Ming dynasty was Matteo Ricci, and the Qing dynasty is a little bit less well known, but 𝗄𝗶𝘁𝗵 Castiglione, who was the painter who redefined, of course, the aesthetics of Chinese painting in the 18th century. I mean, so this is the background. Also, Italy was not part of during the so-called century of humiliation of that process of expansion of European interests in China, and so this is very sensitive. Of course, the narrative on the century of humiliation is still very relevant in the Chinese historical identity, but also political elaboration, and Italy was not part of this process. So I think that this is valued by the Chinese in the sense that Italy was a counterpart in terms of cultural dialogue, peaceful cooperation, but not that sort of clash of civilizations which happened during the 19th century.
You built a career that spans NATO, Washington, Panama, Cambridge, Georgetown, and now finally Beijing. What advice would you give to young Europeans who want to work on China or build a career in diplomacy today?
Well, I think that diplomacy is on one hand a traditional job, but on the other hand has been changing very much, but is also a gateway to many worlds. And I think that it's also bureaucratic work, it's related to the interest of your state, but I think that for young Europeans it's also a big opportunity to live an international life, to develop an international career, because I mean, you can be a diplomat in your national diplomatic service, but of course now we have also European diplomacy, which is relevant, and I think that we should develop even more, but is also, and for this reason I use the term gateway, is also a way to, for instance, to work seconded, for instance, to other international organizations, and this is an opportunity that a lot of young diplomats can benefit from. And the other thing is that I mean, I would like to call diplomats, this is perhaps a little bit too much, but I'm convinced of this, intellectuals in action. So we have to achieve concrete results, but I don't think that we can do it without having a very strong intellectual and cultural focus on the issues that we address and we try to solve. So is a job which offers a lot of opportunities of lifelong learning. Of course, also to live in foreign countries is a completely different experience than simply traveling to foreign countries, because of course living in China, in Beijing, is not the same thing that spending also some months traveling in China. So it's a big opportunity. And the other thing, of course, we have an identity which is related to our own roots, but I think that we have also a European identity, especially the younger generations which have, of course, taken advantage of things such as Erasmus. I think that gradually there will be a European demos. We have our national identities, but we should also remind ourselves that in the past, Europeans in the Middle Ages regarded themselves different reasons, but as belonging to the same community, to the same commonwealth, to the same cultural identity. So I think this is an important heritage that we don't forget. We should not forget, and also that we have to revive in the right manner. Also because I think that the potential of competition, we have talked a lot today about competition, is also related to a strong identity, and China is a good case in point in this regard. And Europe needs to strengthen its identity as an international actor to be successful also on the many fronts that we need a new phase of competition, of technological development, and also, I think, of political and strategic collaboration.
Looking ahead, what do you believe will be the defining challenge for the next generation of young Europeans engaging with China?
To be aware of the speed and of the complexity of change related to artificial intelligence and innovative technologies. I mean, to be aware that we are late as Europe and that we have to bridge this gap to interact on an equal footing with these very competitive counterparts, but that this is not necessarily a pattern only of confrontation, of competition in a negative way. It's also a recognition that we can be very competitive and we can interact with China in a way which is also conducive to this rebalancing of our relationship in concrete terms, and also to be aware that there is a lot to learn, to exchange in cultural terms, that of course we are the two oldest civilizations on the planet, and that our links are very ancient, so we can revive this past to take advantage of something which is of course key, which is cultural dialogue and which is mutual understanding. It will not be easy. In this respect, I think that we should be critical realists. So realism is important, but it should be also perhaps made more sophisticated through that lens of sophisticated theories of knowledge, of understanding, which, by the way, were developed in the past in a very far-sighted way in our continent. So I think that we are very, very well equipped, and the younger generations, I'm sure that they will be absolutely protagonists of this process in the right way.
Thank you so much. That is the end of our interview. It's been such an honor to talk to you, Ambassador. Thank you so much.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for watching.